The U.S. has at least 1.5 million frozen embryos. Spain's got 600,000. The UK's got 500. They estimate that the world has 10 million. Suffice it to say, we have a problem on our hands.
Conor, in my opinion, the most important question that's raised by this, how do we stop the assembly line?
Yes.
We call this the Wild West of infertility.
Yeah.
There's no regulation because there's only one golden rule that drives the entire infertility industry. If it makes gold, it's good.
But once you have these frozen embryos, what do we do with them?
The church recognizes that there's a context in which the gift of life must be handed on. Because the moment you take it out of that context, out of marital intimacy, splay it out into the laboratory, put it into a petri dish or a test tube, start manhandling, manipulating, flash freezing, shining the bright lights of the laboratory onto these embryos, you are instrumentalizing fellow human beings for your own purposes. You are treating them as objects, not as subjects of infinite and inestimable value.
If we cloned you right now, how do we know that you have a soul? The church teaches that the soul is infused at the moment of conception, but with cloning, there's not conception.
This is a very complicated area. I actually wrote 2 theses on this when I was in Rome on the question of ensoulment of the human embryo. Unfortunately, what you just said is not actually correct.
Okay, so
from the point of view of the church's teaching.
About conception.
Correct.
Tell me. Boy, I didn't expect this. All right. All right. This is good. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Father Ty, we're really late coming here because we just got lost in great conversation at lunch. And we made our camera guys wait forever. So sorry, guys. It's so easy to talk. We just could talk for hours.
It was a wonderful lunch.
Yeah.
It's covered a lot of ground.
We did.
Yeah.
We solved all the world's problems.
Definitely in all the churches as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's a pleasure to have you here. And as I was telling you on the car ride over here that I have a vivid memory of my first encounter with you was in 2002 or 3, I think we determined. And you were speaking about a fascinating topic in DC. It was the Catholic Scholars Institute, or I forget the term. I was in graduate school up in DC, and I heard about this event, and I went, and there was this young priest who had the subject was frozen embryos, what to do with frozen embryos and adoption of embryos, and whether that was morally acceptable. What do you do with? Do you thaw them out? Do you let, very charitable women adopt them into their womb? And this was a brand new topic, and pretty much everyone was in favor of adopting embryos, was perfectly fine. But you were the very small minority and were saying, no, I don't think that's the right thing to do. So we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, it's amazing you bring up that meeting, because I do remember it, and I also remember myself struggling, very kind of almost existentially over this issue. And I was going through a book that was a doctoral thesis by somebody with the last name ASCI. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. On the marital.
Assi.
Yeah, on the marital.
You're
act.
kidding. The Steubenville professor in Austria.
Yeah.
Professor Aschi. Why am I forgetting his first name?
I don't remember his first name.
But I had him as a professor in Austria.
Well, this book that he wrote on the marital act,
yes.
I was going through it very slowly, and it just had all kinds of points that I thought, this connects with an argument against embryo adoption, and this does as well. So, and that was a long time ago, as you say. It was right at the beginning, really, of the debates around it.
Yeah.
And that's neat that you and I connected up at least a little bit.
I know.
As far back as that.
I know, and I picked up the microphone when they had open questions for people in the crowd, and I grabbed it, and I said something like, I don't even want to recount what I said, because I was probably just a total fool. But I remember kind of arguing against you, and I thought it was uncharitable to unplug these things and let them thaw. I thought it was like, there's all these wonderful women who would be willing to adopt these embryos. And I just thought that you were just way off. But over the last 20 years, the more traditional or orthodox leaning bioethicists and theologians have come around to your side. You were the minority, and now you're not not as minority as you once were. So, I mean, I just commend you for kind of the bravery, the fortitude of kind of sticking to your guns early on. But we're going to get to that.
All right. Well, thank you.
But I want to get first to just the current event news of Colossal Biosciences, this firm. I looked it up, and I think they've raised like $435 million. They're valued at like $10 billion. What their goal is to bring back woolly mammoth. Father, Jurassic Park's here.
Well, it sure seems like it. And I mean, they have already provided some evidence that they may be able to do at least part of what they're proposing to do. This de-extinction of species, it's actually a pretty tall order, Conor, because to really do it completely, what you would have to do is get an entire genome of one of these extinct animals. Now, that's not so easy. They're scraping around inside these fossils. They pull out a tooth and then they're digging in the base of the skull trying to get something from 10,000 or longer years ago. In one case, I think it was 70,000 that they had this fossil. So, that's not easy to do. It's a Herculean challenge. They're improving the technology all the time, getting better and better. But then what you end up getting is usually fragmentary. It's not complete. So what they're doing, let's just kind of be clear about this. The story that garnered all the clicks, if you will, was the story about the dire wolf. So they claimed they had.
Kevin's got a picture just to put them up on there, but keep going. But
they're so cute. The ones that the little pups, beautiful white coats. And the claim was, the claim at least by some of the press was that, there we go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, they're just wonderful.
And, it's cool to kind of hear a little
bit of the howl.
Yeah.
Yeah. It kind of has a primordial sound to it. Yeah. And so the claim was, is this a resurrected dire wolf? Well, bottom line here is no, not even close. This is a gray wolf that has had maybe 24 gene changes introduced. Yes, based on the stuff that they dug out of that fossil, but it is nowhere near a complete genome of the entire extinct dire wolf. So what it is, in effect, is a kind of hybrid, if you will, between a gray wolf and the dire wolf.
They kind of made a new species.
Yeah, or a new construct. I'm not sure even if it's a new species. I think it would probably still fit in as a gray wolf.
Okay.
So, but now does this mean it's not impressive? No, it is impressive, and for them to be able to do this and pull it off, it's an incredible bio kind of achievement.
Right.
That's impressive.
Is it wrong morally? Is it morally wrong at all to do this? I mean, we bred Bernie doodles, part Bernie Mountain Dog, part poodle. I mean, we're basically doing what they just did. It's like a
right. Selective breeding.
It's just selective breeding.
For centuries. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and the bottom line here, I think, becomes one of a question of our relationship to the animal kingdom. So, what are our duties towards animals? And we obviously are permitted to use animals for legitimate purposes. We eat them, we make clothing out of them, etc. When there's a proportionate reason, then we can make use of them. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't recognize that they coexist with us in the whole animal kingdom, and that, for example, I sometimes bring up this tendency of some people to want to eat foie gras. Now, foie gras is prepared by putting basically a pipe down the throat of a goose and massively force-feeding it, making the goose get huge, making the liver enormous, and then killing the goose and harvesting the pate out of it.
That's awful.
Yeah, it's a kind of animal torture that is done. And I think we should ask ourselves, look, why are we doing this, to these poor animals? Do we have a real proportionate reason for doing what we're doing? Or is this, kind of the term sometimes I've used is morose delectation? Just kind of, wanting to satisfy the palate at any cost. And is this a mistreatment of animals? So there are limits here, but clearly the animal kingdom is here for our utilization. And if we have good reasons to make genetic changes in some of these animals, and maybe even someday in the future to actually de-extinct something, then I think there's not going to be any fundamental ethical problems with it.
Okay, so if we could bring back the Tyrannosaurus Rex and put him in a zoo.
Well, all right, so here's part of the question. I think there was one commentator who said, look, if all this is going to happen is these animals are going to end up in a zoo, stop, he said. We don't want to be doing this just to stick animals in zoos. He's like, no, you got to think about some ecological goods here that are at play. What kinds of changes do we... So I'm going to give you an example. They did some rewilding, they call it rewilding, in Yellowstone National Park. I believe it was 1996. And what they did was they brought in I think it was the red wolf, and because there were too many elk, and they said we need to cull the elk, so we're going to reintroduce the red wolf, and it turned out that worked pretty well.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so the levels of elk kind of came down, and the level of wolves stabilized. So you have a kind of ecological match, and everybody was like impressed. But the problem is here that ecological environments and habitats are complex. They really are. And a lot of times you have this law of unintended consequences. So one good example that I like to remind people about is the cane toad. This toad was introduced in Australia at the end of, I think it was around maybe 1890s or early 1900s, I forget. But they were having some serious insect problems. And they thought, well, we'll bring in the cane toads. And just, they'll eat all the insects. So they did that. They started eating insects, sure. But it turned out that the cane toads were poisonous when any of the other animals in the food chain started to eat them. And it just decimated all kinds of other species. And they didn't know that this was going to happen ahead of time. So this idea that by doing a de-extinction of a particular species, that we first know enough about the habitat to be able to say, well, and here's one of the arguments that gets made. And to me, this is, borderline hard to believe that they're serious when they do this. But they say, if we could bring back the woolly mammoth and we could repopulate the entirety of Siberia with all these woolly mammoths, they would stamp down on the snow, the permafrost, and on a number of shrubs and other types of bushes. And this would change the methane gas release and alter the global warming profile in a very positive way for the planet.
That sounds like the biggest load.
Isn't that unbelievable?
Only an expert with a PhD would come up with that.
Right. It's hard to fathom.
No offense with somebody with a PhD. Sorry.
I hear you, and I'm in agreement. So, these are sometimes, I think, justifications. So going back to Colossal for a second, what's really motivating them? I don't want to be too negative here, but I'm convinced that there's a sense in which what is driving the current endeavor by the company is they're trying to find the most charismatic megavertebrate. And woolly mammoths are very charismatic. And dire wolves, as we saw, they're very charismatic. Everybody warms up. And what is this going to do? It's going to improve investment in your company.
Yeah.
That's what's driving. Not a concern about, is there a particular ecological niche that we've got to address, some deficiency, some significant, area that requires remediation. No, that's not at the center. But they will claim that it is.
There's your woolly mouse.
Oh, there we go. The woolly mouse. Yes. And interesting,
goodness.
That when they made that woolly mouse, they didn't even use genes from the woolly mammoth.
Really?
No, they used some other animals' genes to make them woolly like that. Oh. So it was kind of to just generate an appearance. And just staying on the dire wolf for a second, a lot of people think, okay, so what did they do? To do the dire wolf, they took an egg from the gray wolf, and then they did a kind of cloning procedure where they introduced some of the genes from the dire wolf, and then once they had the clone, then they would implant it into a gray wolf. Well, actually, that's not how most of it worked. The only thing that was from the dire wolf and the gray wolf, the dire wolf was the genes. The gray wolf was there was very little actual beyond the fact that they had used the genome there to insert into. So the actual egg came from a dog, and the gestation of the dire wolves also occurred in dogs.
Are you serious?
Yes. And then they did a C-section, a cesarean, to cut out because the dogs were growing really fast. I mean, the dire wolf was growing really fast inside the dog, and they did a C-section. So,
oh my gosh.
But
it's
you realize
a little misleading.
it is a little misleading,
Yeah.
but it also reminds you of how complicated the whole de-extinction thing is. Because think about a woolly mammoth. How are they going to do that? There's no woolly mammoths that you can impregnate.
Right.
You got to go to big elephants.
Yeah.
And then, again, you may have problems. Are the woolly mammoths going to grow too fast? Are they, is the gestation, et cetera? There's a lot of complicated biology here. And these companies are doing some very good work, I think, in terms of ferreting out details of animal biology that will be useful down the road. But again, I don't think it's appropriate yet to call it
de-extinction. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was remiss in mentioning some of your bio. I just kind of forgot because we jumped into the topic. So I'm just going to go ahead and say before we get into kind of my big question about the de-extinction thing, but I just want to mention that you're a leading expert in the field of bioethics. You've given hundreds of presentations and participated in debates, which is what I first saw you in 20 plus years ago, roundtable discussions. You have a PhD in neuroscience from Yale University and worked as a molecular biologist at Harvard Medical School. So those credentials are pretty darn top-notch. You've testified in several state legislatures during deliberation over stem cell research and cloning. In 2020, you were appointed to the National Institute of Health Fetal Tissue Research Ethic Advisory Board and currently serves as the senior ethicist at the National Catholic Bioethics Center. We had Bill Donahue here not too long ago, and I told him you were coming, and he said he's the world expert. He's the guy. So
it's very kind of him.
And
Wow.
I was telling you that I think it's extremely important that Catholic priests deal with the secular world and secular issues. And when you walk into a room with your collar on, it shows, you know what, the Catholic Church has something to contribute, especially given that, the world plays this silly game that the church and science are at odds with each other. So I should have read that when we got started, but I mean, you got the credentials. So,
well, your point about us sort of interacting with the world, as much as we can, I think it's true and valuable. And it's hard to do. I do recall, I think I was mentioning to you over lunch, going into Johns Hopkins University one time when they were having a scientific conference on human embryonic stem cell research. And, it was a big amphitheater type setup, all kinds of scientists from all kinds of backgrounds from Johns Hopkins there. And I walk in through the side door and you see all the heads turn, and look at me dressed this way and say, what is he doing here? Yeah. And, had some good discussions with one of the presenters who was actively pushing for the use of human embryonic stem cells. So we do need to be present, to the extent that we can. I think the other piece, though, always to emphasize is we can't take the kind of clerical, mindset where we say it's got to be priests who do everything. No, this is really where the laity, too. Sure. And in a place like Johns Hopkins, you've got a lot of Catholics. They need to have the kind of faith and strength to give witness where they are. That's also then going to work well, when you have priests and others who are in the clergy or in religious life who are giving a unique type of witness. Yeah,
that's awesome. Now, the last question I have on the de-extinction, and then we'll move on to some other topics. Neanderthal Man. How close are we to that? Well, just talk to me about that.
Yeah, so Neanderthal Man, my understanding is that we actually have produced a complete sequence.
I've heard the same.
Yes. So that's impressive. We have the whole sequence. We can compare it to our own. And the problem here, though, technically, we're not going to be able to make Neanderthal Man yet. Why not? Because even though we have the genetic sequence in our computer, we don't have the kinds of tools that will allow us to generate these absolutely enormous stretches of DNA that are in a typical human chromosome.
But can't AI do that now?
No, this is actually manufacturing it. In other words, there aren't tools. There isn't a way to manipulate something. Because when you stretch out, for example, some of the the genes, the entire sequence in all of our chromosomes, it's the kind of thing that would reach all the way to the moon and back.
So we're not talking about doing math. We're actually talking about
biology, lab biology. Yeah, that's the issue. We don't have the techniques to be able to manhandle that huge amount of DNA and keep it all, together, not breaking structures, and then being able to introduce it into cells. So we can't do the whole procedure now. Now, what we could do, and this would not be good if we went down this path, start with a human embryo and use already extant human genes that are there and do what we did with the
dire wolves.
Just start changing a number of genes and say, well, this was something that came from Neanderthal and this one came from Neanderthal. And now we've got this package where we've got, 5% of the genes are from Neanderthal, and a huge amount of work to get 5% of genes, meaning years and years of hard labor. But now we take it, do the cloning, insert it into a woman, and generate a pregnancy.
Maybe these are hard questions. Maybe these are easy. I don't know. But do you have an opinion on whether Neanderthal man had a soul?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't think we know enough to be able to.
We just don't know the history.
Yeah.
Are they descendants of Adam or not? Like, we just don't know, right?
Yeah, I don't think there's enough data to sort of fully understand the branch points,
right?
What happened in transitions. There's a lot of missing data, and I just prefer not to get speculative.
Yeah, that's why I kind of qualified it. I mean, it's interesting, but
it is interesting.
We're going into dangerous territory there.
Yeah.
But I can say this. If they were to, or if they already have, done the dire wolf thing with Neanderthal, and some baby comes out looking like a Neanderthal, and they got some genetic material in there that's Neanderthal, we'd have to presume that they're human, made in the image and likeness of God. I mean, wouldn't you? If somebody says, "Here's my half Neanderthal baby," will you baptize the baby? You would probably baptize the baby, wouldn't you?
I would say so. But precisely because we would know that the way it was done was what I just described. You started with a human embryo. You started with a human being, and you're just tinkering and manipulating that human being in order to get some variant now that's looking more and more Neanderthal. So yes, you would presume you would start there. Mm-hmm. If such an experiment, such a horrible experiment, were to be done.
Well, I look. If it can be done, they're going to. I mean, somebody's going to.
That's a good question because if you recall a few years back, there was a fellow in China who made genetic changes into human embryos. And then he took these human embryos and implanted them, and he claimed that there were 2 babies that were born. And he announced this at an international meeting in Hong Kong. And there was a huge furor and almost a kind of uprising among the other scientists. Wait, how did you do? Why didn't you come to us and tell us that you were doing this? And so tremendous pushback and backlash. And then in China, they kind of got embarrassed back on mainland China. He went back, they had a trial. Really? And he was put under house arrest, and he was imprisoned for 2 years house arrest for violating ethics.
Really?
Yeah. Now, this was fascinating because if he had been at a university in the U.S. and he had done this,
he might get an award or something.
Or at least he certainly wouldn't have been under house arrest. His name would have been everywhere. So it was a very interesting kind of double standard, and that ethics were used, and the only people who really enforce ethics was this communist state.
Yeah.
And of course, it's not so much ethics for them; it's a reputation.
Yeah,
it's an embarrassment.
They're embarrassed. Yeah,
yeah.
It's not ethics.
Yeah. So these kinds of things, when scientists venture a little bit too far out of their lane, other scientists don't like it. Now, there is a kind of some sense of a moral parameters that should be guiding things, and a lot of times it's not where it should be among scientists, but there's still something. That's my point.
Yeah.
So it's for somebody to go in and suddenly announce that they've made a Neanderthal, unlikely. I don't see that, happening in short term. It's going to be the kind of thing they're going to want to do it incrementally. They're going to, just like doing with the mice first, and you sort of get people acclimated and used to these sorts of things before you venture into the whole thing.
Now, all right, before we get to frozen embryos adoption, because I really want to spend most of our time there. We're just butting right up against this gene editing, CRISPR.
Yes, CRISPR-Cas9.
And I've been trying to understand that. I still can't remember what CRISPR stands for, but I remember. Do you know Bob Destro?
No.
Okay, so he's a professor at Catholic U back when I was there, and he was doing some legislative work for a congressman from Iowa who was dealing with some cloning legislation. And again, this is 20 years ago when gene editing was brand spanking new, right? And the idea, I remember speaking with this congressman who, I just won't say his name because I don't ever know what really happened with this, but what they were trying to do was farmers were working with gene editing people, and they were trying to say, okay, we can make cows that are like that, where their milk has insulin in it, and so little kids could just drink a glass of milk rather than having to get like insulin shots. You know, they were talking about how the technology was getting to that point where you could drink a glass of milk and get your medicine. I don't know if that ever happened, if that was ever a real thing, but
those kinds of approaches do make a lot of sense. Now, my understanding was that it wouldn't go quite as you described it, where it would be a glass of milk that you would drink, but instead the cows were being turned into kind of bioreactors, and you produce gallons of milk full of a particular desired molecule like insulin or some immunoglobulin, some antibody, something like that, and then you have gallons of it, and you can easily purify it.
Oh, okay.
So it's a way to quickly get large amounts of needed and important bioactive molecules. And that approach is very clever. That, in my opinion, is using, going back to our earlier
That's
argument,
what I was questioning.
the animal kingdom.
You like that?
I like that in the sense that this serves real medical needs of man, and is very creative in one sense. So gene editing in that sense, I think, is very promising and very positive.
Look at that. He just found something.
Oh, look at that.
Milk to the rescue for diabetics. Illinois project creates first insulin-producing cow. I did not know he was going to throw that up there, but
look at that.
I mean, I didn't make it up.
Yeah, there you go.
Somebody's trying to do it.
And they're calling it the first transgenic cow, yes, capable of producing human insulin. Yeah, this is I think, interesting and promising research.
Interesting.
And, now I suspect it's probably not just cows, but there are probably other animals.
Well, that was dated March 13th, 2024.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, I talked about this on Capitol Hill in 2003 or 4.
Yes.
I mean, so they've been working on this.
They've been working
while.
hard. Yes.
All right. Let's see here. You want to move to the frozen embryos?
Sure. I mean, do you want to say anything about human cloning at this point?
Yeah, I do. Yeah,
because that's kind of connected to what we've been talking about.
Yes, absolutely. I love it. Tell me, first of all, in preparation for this, I think I learned more biology than I did in all of high school, because I actually was using ChatGPT, and I was like how does cloning work? And I looked at all these pictures, and so you have a, I think we should kind of touch on the basics. So you have see if I get this right. Mm-hmm. If the professor will give me a grade at the end. So you have a nucleus, which I barely know what it is, right? But you have the genetic material on the inside of this, so you have I guess you can have an egg, and it has like a nucleus in there.
That's right.
And then you extract you can take the nucleus out, and now you have a denucleated egg. Right. And then you take other nucleuses that have, I guess, other material or something in there, and put it in there.
Let's say you want to clone me.
Right.
Scrape off some skin cells from my wrist.
Right.
Those contain all my genes. Now, the all is important, because that egg that you were talking about doesn't have all the genes. Has half. Because it's waiting for the sperm to get the other half.
Yeah.
So you've removed the half, and now you take my skin cell nucleus, dump it inside that egg.
Right.
And you have just created a human embryo with the full complement, with all my genes.
Right.
And now, if you were to implant it into a woman, you can grow it in the lab for a few days, but then you have to give it the safe harbor and protection of a woman's uterus, and then it will take off and continue down the developmental pathway and produce a baby 9 months later.
Now, I was trying to figure out, isn't that basically an identical twin? But apparently it's close. I mean,
yes, it's very close. The only differences are in what's called the mitochondria. They have slightly different genes of their own, which is outside the nucleus. They're important genes.
Right.
So depending on who gave you the woman's egg, that's going to alter the constitution of that particular embryo.
So, is there any? So, okay, what's the status of cloning, and what's the moral implications of that? And is there any version of goodness from this, or is it just all bad, bad, bad?
Well, animal cloning again.
Oh, the sheep, Dolly.
There you go. Or what about thoroughbred racehorses or dogs and cats? And
all right, Dolly was in 1996.
96.
I looked it up.
I was still in seminary.
Isn't that
I remember
crazy?
when it happened. I was like shocked. The first thing I said to myself after I read the article about Dolly, I hope they don't ever do this in humans.
Yeah, because here's the ultimate question I have for you is, how do you know if we cloned you right now, how do we know that you have a soul? Because the church teaches that the soul is infused at the moment of conception, but with cloning, there's not conception. Now, according to my research, once they put that genetic material back into the egg, you get the nucleus back in the egg, they have to shock it with an electric pulse or something to make the cells start replicating. Is that when kind of a conception begins? How do you handle that?
So,
am I even in the right ballpark here in this question?
Well, this is a very complicated area. I actually wrote 2 theses on this when I was in Rome, on the question of ensoulment of the human embryo.
There you go. Okay.
And,
oh, really?
Yeah, and unfortunately, what you just said is not actually correct.
Okay, so
from the point of view of the church's teaching
about conception.
Correct.
Tell me, because
So
I would think 99.9% of well-formed Catholics would say
that. You're correct. Most Catholics.
Boy, I didn't expect this. All right, this is good. Okay.
Yeah. The church has never defined the precise moment of the infusion of the immortal, immaterial, rational human soul into the embryo. It has never defined it. It has left it as an open question, and for some very, I think, legitimate reasons, the church has recognized, especially in modern times, this is likely to prove more complicated in sorting out all the pieces than might appear on first glance. So it's a very nice kind of simple pro-life mantra to repeat.
From conception to natural death.
Yeah, conception, that the soul is infused by God, and therefore you have to treat the embryo this way or that way, and so on. Now, I don't know. We can go this. I one time gave a talk at Boston College. This was probably around 2005, 2006, on embryonic stem cell research, and afterwards had a Q&A with the students. And we got into this topic of ensoulment of embryos, and we were talking for the next 2 hours about this. So, I would see this as a potential direction we could go if you'd like. I can try to summarize it a little bit in shorter terms, but it's actually a complicated, set of considerations that are involved biologically in the way that human beings develop, and the question of, what constitutes a suitable substrate for God to carry out his ensouling action upon us at that very, very early time point. And part of the difficulty, and you hinted at this maybe earlier, was with twinning. That in twinning situations, you can have twins forming very early in a pregnancy, or as late as potentially many, many days into the pregnancy, where you have a single embryo and suddenly it splits into 2.
I hadn't thought about that.
I know. Most people have not.
That right there, just kind of common sense, kind of blows a hole in the conception.
Absolutely, makes it more nuanced. Or there's another phenomenon that I suspect you may not have heard of either, which involves, for example, if you have a black mouse embryo and a white mouse embryo, the 2 embryos, you put them close to each other, they touch, and when they touch, they sort of fuse together, and you end up having a mouse that's striped that gets born. Now, you can say, all right, well, that's mice, sounds very nice. Can it happen in humans? Yes, it has been proven that it happens in humans. And in fact, one of the interesting cases was you had a male human embryo, and this was during an in vitro fertilization process, a female one, the 2 of them touched, they fused, and you had a child born that manifested some hermaphroditic properties.
Yeah.
Now, you have a question here. All right, you have a male and a female. If you're going to take, that kind of line, it's at the moment of conception. So you have a female soul, male soul, you touch, Now, what do you have? What happened to the second soul? Souls don't ride along as kind of, passengers in the carriage. The soul is the form of the body, and it is integral to what you're dealing with, especially when you're dealing with, the immortal, immaterial, rational soul of humans, which is, something clearly in contradistinction to anything that an animal has. Animals have souls as forms, but not immortal, immaterial, and rational. So there's, some complexity here about how this happens. Aquinas got into, some discussions on this. And
but he had bad science.
Well, he had bad science, but, he had he was a very powerful thinker, and he was very logical in the way he approached matters, and he could see there might be a possibility for something like, that you would have some sort of precursor organizing principle, which itself was receptive then to the arrival of that immortal, immaterial, rational soul. And already the humanness of the entity is clearly established, because from human parents always come human progeny. You don't get zebras or giraffes out of, human sex cells.
Right.
So he could, already see something. I mean, he didn't know that much about sex cells per se, but he could see a kind of logic here that would undergird the type of reasoning, about what God would be able to do in the face of ensoulment questions.
So you don't have like a day. And you probably think that the church just can't rule.
Right.
They can't say day 2, day 3, but you would not say implantation.
Right.
Because that's just a location of where it is.
Correct.
Right. I mean, so I've heard some people say that, but that can't be it, because that's just where it's moved. It doesn't have anything to do with the actual development of that unique entity
but
itself.
let me maybe just jump to kind of the key ethical point here, which would be something like this. Even if it's the case that God does not infuse the immortal, immaterial, rational soul into the human being until the human being graduates from law school, it would still be wrong to attack the human being at any point prior to graduation.
Wow. Because of
the fact that the kind of entity that this already is constituted as, because of the fact that it came from human parents, human beings, mother and father that are both human, it is already the type of entity, the only kind of entity in the entire known universe that is capable of receiving that unique gift of the immortal, immaterial, rational human soul. It has the kind of substrate, it has the kind of, receptivity and structure that will allow it to receive that gift. So in virtue of that already, primordium that it is sacrosanct and may never be violated. So quite
amazing. It has the potentiality, it has potency.
But it also has actuality. And that's what's important. Actuality of its humanness. It is not a dog or a plant that is magically transformed. It is already from human parents. It is what it is in its essence. And the question of when God does God's business of infusing an immortal, immaterial, rational human soul into the embryo, we don't know. And we may be able to talk about it until the cows come home and never know. Augustine struggled with this question. Early in his career, he said something like, well, I think it happens at the beginning. Then later he said, I think it happens later in the process of, the
quickening.
Embryo.
They said the
quickening. I think it happens later. And then he said later, no, I think it's early. Then he said, I have no idea when it occurs, And I think that's the important point here. Now, I'm going to make one other point on this while we're on the topic, just because I think this is also another interesting point that people don't tend to think about with sufficient depth. There's an argument out there by pro-abortion minded individuals, and it goes pretty much like this. And they try to, sort of pull in Catholic teaching in some fashion and use it against Catholics. They'll say, well, look, Aquinas, he sometimes seemed to be opting for delayed ensoulment. So prior to the point of ensouling the embryo, Well, what do you have? Well, you have something that's not human. It doesn't have a soul. It's not yet a human person. The argument becomes, if it's not a human person, then we can go in there. We can do an abortion. There won't be any loss of anything. And I'm like, wait a minute. You're not thinking logically if you make those set of assertions. Why not? Because in this situation, you are dealing with, if you do choose to attack that embryo, you are doing something worse than murder. Now you can say to yourself, no, wait, how can you do anything worse than murder? If you just kill an embryo, you're murdering someone. This is horrible. Why would it be worse than murder? Because this entity, if it's the case that it has not been ensouled, and of course the church hasn't said one way or the other, and you and I don't know, but if it is hypothetically the case that that embryo has not received its soul, and you go in and you destroy it, what have you done? You have destroyed the very principle by which that human being was going to have an eternal destiny with God in the afterlife, because that principle is the soul. And the soul was not yet infused. You came in and you destroyed the very substrate and matrix that God was intending to infuse with that soul, again, assuming it's delayed, which we don't know. And therefore, you did something worse than murder because you took away the possibility of an individual having a face-to-face relationship with God for all eternity. Meanwhile, when you killed an embryo that has been ensouled, that embryo, it had a soul. Sure, it dies. There's the possibility and the likelihood that that embryo will see God face-to-face in the afterlife.
I see it. I see what you're saying. I mean,
so the logic here is all twisted.
You're right. You're right. I mean, it's you have this entity that has a person, even if it doesn't have that indwelling soul yet. There's some kind of human nature there.
Correct.
And it's created in the natural order, the sole purpose of housing a soul. And then, and all the body is extremely dignified too. So you've actually robbed a body of its immortal soul. And then now that body can never become glorified either in heaven. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So you've destroyed the very reason that it was created.
Yes.
As opposed to when you kill a body that has a indwelled soul, infused soul, then they kind of are just fast forwarding to the end of what they're going to get anyway.
There you go.
You're robbing something of its eternal.
And let me make a little analogy. Let's see.
I get it.
Yeah, I'm glad you see it. It's an important point.
I'm trying to put words on it, but I get it.
I think you got it exactly. But maybe I'll use this analogy. You can see if you like it or not. I mean, to me, it kind of captured my imagination when I thought of this at one point. I like to imagine Michelangelo, and he goes out to the granite quarry, and he's looking around at all these different pieces of granite. Or marble. Marble.
Okay.
He was using marble that are being, cut out of the quarry. And he finds one, and there's, particular veins that he sees in the marble. And, he is such a magnificent and creative artist that the position of those veins that run through the marble, he says, this is the one. This is the one. And he says, I'm going to pay you, however many $1,000s you want for this huge block of marble. And I'm going to go and I'm going to make, I don't know, the Pietà or David or whatever it is he's going to be making.
Yeah.
All right. And so he's transporting it back and, probably horse and carriage in those days, and gets it close to his studio. And out in the street, some hooligan runs up with a massive sledgehammer and starts slamming against this piece of marble and totally destroys it. And Michelangelo says, no way I can put this back together. And it's like, what has happened here? I saw what this was to be.
That's a beautiful analogy because even he talked about how he saw the image in the stone and he just had to cut away.
Yes, just take away the pieces.
Take away the pieces until it
emerged. And this is what God does.
God is looking at this embryo.
Yes.
And he's seeing this sperm and egg that came together, and it has its own entity right there, its own essence.
Absolutely.
And he's looking at it like this perfect and according to his plan, it's a perfect dwelling place for an eternal soul.
Yes.
And then
also a place for his grace to operate throughout the life of that future individual and, to be transformed into his image. I mean, what a beautiful thing it is.
It is. And so we're not only like putting a massive halt on God's creative force of the soul, but we're also it's kind of like a sacrilegious or a denigration of the material that's glorious in its own right.
Yes.
And it was supposed to become a tabernacle for this immortal soul, and it doesn't get to be.
Yes.
It's amazing. Wow, it is worse than murder.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
People don't think about it.
No,
that way,
but that's the way we'll look at it in heaven.
Yes.
Looking at it somewhat metaphysically.
If it's the case, again,
if it's the case.
In
no,
soul.
I see it.
Yeah,
if it's the case,
may be
because we don't know.
Yeah,
it could be
earlier,
So,
because to go back to the twinning thing, and then maybe we can move on if you want.
Yeah.
But if it is the case that, let's say you have a twin that forms 1 week after conception, in the beginning you could have a single embryo, single soul. Let's positing it does get infused at that moment. And then the embryo grows, gets bigger and bigger. At 1 week, there's a splitting event, a fission, separation. And at that moment, the soul is in one, stays with the material of one, but then in that very moment of separation, God infuses another. But what that does say to you, if you think about it, is that second infusion is de facto delayed. It came later, came a week later.
Unless you could say there was two souls in the original. You can't. Okay.
You can't have two souls occupying simultaneously the same matter. Because if it's the form of the matter, it's what makes it be what it is. And to the extent that you have a single embryo there, you can't. It doesn't work.
Right.
Now, this gets into some complicated cases of conjoined twins.
Hey, thanks guys for checking out the Conor Gallagher Show. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, or comment, or whatever you got to do to support it. And I appreciate that very much.
And conjoined twins share various body parts. You may have, an arm is missing, and here there's a whole other torso, and the person is attached. Yeah. But you would say, all right, in that case, there's two brains. And we would say there's two separate people, two souls.
Are there two separate DNA patterns with that, or one?
It's one because it's a single cell that started, a single zygote, and the genetic material was just partitioned to both. It's a partial division. It's not a complete twinning. So it's a partial cleavage.
That's a mess for a dissertation right there.
It points out again that you can have these situations where you're sort of pushing back further and harder on what constitutes the essential substrate for the soul.
And interesting, these weird cases actually help you find some clarity on the metaphysical question.
Potentially.
Yeah.
They point to some possibilities. And they point to the importance, I think, also of the brain and the central nervous system in this. That we all have a sense, that there's a way in which I am my brain. Now, of course, I'm more than my brain, but there's a way in which that occupies a centrality to my identity that's far greater than saying I am my heart or I am my liver.
Sure, yeah.
So, and that, it kind of dovetails nicely here with these notions of soul as well. When you have twinning, there's partial and Siamese twins then.
Yeah, you got two brains, you're going to have two souls.
Yeah, two people.
But you might have one brain and four arms. Well, you got one soul.
Yeah,
with four arms. That's just right.
Yeah, you're not going
to have two souls with one brain.
Well, the other complication is that there are some types of situations of Siamese twins that don't survive. And what are those? Those are when you have two heads fused. When you have, one brain here, and there's a fusion, there's a separation for twinning, but the brains don't completely separate.
Yeah.
And then you end up almost invariably, if there's significant shared brain tissue between the two people, they always die. They die. It's not compatible with life. It's not possible to have a human being that way sharing a brain. You can share other body parts and livers and arms, and there's these girls in Wisconsin you may have seen, one body, two heads.
I've seen,
and they're amazing. The Hensel twins. But you have two heads. But when the heads start fusing, it's a no-go. Your humanity.
Amazing.
So limit cases help us think through.
They do.
The substrate.
It forces the mind to think on a different level.
Yes.
That's for sure.
Yes.
It's incredible. It's incredible. So, so I guess we were on I don't know how we got there.
We're going to go to the cloning. Let me just say a little bit about the cloning thing.
Yeah, please.
You were bringing up the question of, does cloning imply
that an individual
the
soul.
wouldn't
And
have a
that's
soul?
right. That's how we got there.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
And I always say to people, look, cloning doesn't really affect anything significant from the point of view of the soul. Because what is cloning? It's just making a good identical twin, not even as good as Mother Nature makes. So I'll ask people who bring this up, I'll say, have you ever met a pair of twins, two twins, one of whom is missing their soul? I say, well, of course not.
Right.
That's not how it works. If the biology,
right.
It recapitulates everything that is supposed to recapitulate in developmental of course there's going to be a soul, because it's ordered, its form is of this type.
Yeah.
So, and it just means, God, whenever he does his infusing, he does it, he's in a sense beholden to his biology. When he sees the requisite order and substrate and integrity of the organism there in its full humanness, then he does his remarkable gift of infusing the immortal, immaterial, rational human soul.
Yeah.
So clones would have to
clones have souls
just as much as anybody.
Right.
It wouldn't be anything different fundamentally there.
But don't go cloning people.
Yeah, don't go cloning. Now, has it happened? Many people wonder. And I when I give lectures on this, once in a while, I'll throw up a picture of the laboratory of Dr. Shaukat Metalipov at Oregon Health Sciences and University.
My brilliant brother right there, he'll pull it up.
Well, man, probably find it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you get that name, Kevin?
Shaukat Metalipov. He's a Russian.
You got that? That's hard to pronounce than your last name.
It is. It's a tough one. Well, in his lab, they have been cloning human beings.
Have they?
For a long time.
Wow. Okay.
But as far as we know, they have not implanted them. Whenever they clone them, they destroy them, they take out the stem cells, they do research on these young and vulnerable human clones. So that has happened. And that first time that happened was, I believe, 2013. So cloning is nothing new. We know how to do it. Metalipov's lab has been particularly adroit in making this happen. They figured out some of the barriers that were preventing it. Previously, they can clone primates rather routinely. But as far as we know, nobody's done the implantation. No babies have been born yet. And it's only a matter of time and sort of, further decline of the ethical lines before we reach the banner on the New York Times that says a human clone was born yesterday at such and so a place.
Right. Right.
So I think it's coming. I think it's
coming.
I'd say 5-10 years at most, in my estimation, before we have clones that are born. Now, there's a certain sense, that, just to be clear on this, in which that proposal, everybody goes, oh, you're going to make clone babies. Isn't that horrible? Oh, we should all be up in arms. That's actually less morally objectionable than what Metalipov is doing. Because he's doing what's called clone and kill. Every time we clone, we kill it.
Yeah.
We're making life to instrumentalize it directly as a product. There you go. That's Shaukat Metalipov. There he is in his lab. Yes. So he, he's the one who's been publishing these papers on clones, human clones, and using their genes for further research and analysis. Wow. And that's worse than...
It's worse. I was about to say. It's
at least let the babies survive if you're going to do this kind of thing. Let the embryos survive. Don't be treating them as just fodder and experimental material. But that's where we've arrived. And this is partly thanks to in vitro fertilization, where we utilize human embryos as raw materials all the time.
All the time.
Yeah, tragically.
That might be a good segue.
Yeah.
And I looked up some numbers. The U.S. has at least, one one place told me 1.5 million frozen embryos. Spain's got 600,000. The UK's got 500. They estimate that the world has 10 million frozen embryos. So suffice it to say, we have a problem on our hands. And these are 10 million human beings, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, precisely.
So
10 million human beings trapped in ice. This is, one of the great injustices of our age.
Yeah.
And nobody's really talking about it. And here's really, Conor, in my opinion, the most important question that's raised by this: how do we stop the assembly line?
Yes.
Because everyone's saying, let's talk about embryo adoption because we have all these leftover embryos and we should be able to implant them into women. And it's like, are you kidding me? Don't you see what that's going to do? That's going to say to the industry, all right, we need a two-tier system.
Wow.
One tier is we do IVF. You pay us, $12,000, we'll make you your own baby. Hey, if you only got 2,000, we have a bunch of spare embryos here. We've got them categorized. Some of them are this race or ethnicity. You tell us what you want. We'll pick it out. You get the product you want. Only 2,000, $2,000, we'll implant you. And then they'll be pressured to keep the stockpiles current. So this idea that by making embryo adoption licit, allowable, is going to solve the problem.
I never even thought about that.
It's all backwards.
It's feeding the machine.
It's feeding the machine, the monster. It's feeding the monster.
What you've done, if you implant these, then you've actually you've turned it into consumerism.
Yes, which it already is. IVF is a huge consumerist, massive industry.
It would skyrocket the demand if you started adopting these things off.
It would feed right into the continuity of this horrible practice of IVF.
All right,
and
so
producing extra eggs.
I don't know. I mean, maybe there's something unique about IVF, but I think most of my listeners know IVF is wrong, right? I mean, we get that, and I guess it's wrong for multiple reasons, but it usually begins with masturbation, right? Yeah. And then it's just an unnatural act of making this conception in a petri dish.
Well, I mean, the word natural versus unnatural, I'm not sure that that's going to strongly sort of capture it here. The church recognizes that there's a context in which the gift of life must be handed on. And it's a context that is unique, privileged, and reserved only to marriage. Yeah. There is no other setting in which the enormity of this gift can be properly safeguarded in the way that it should be, so that full respect is accorded to the gift. Because the moment you take it out of that context, out of marital intimacy, splay it out into the laboratory, put it into a petri dish or a test tube, start manhandling, manipulating, flash freezing, shining the bright lights of the laboratory onto these embryos, you are instrumentalizing fellow human beings for your own purposes. You are treating them as objects, not as subjects of infinite and inestimable value. And that's the move that immediately moves us into sinful territory, always and without exception. Anytime you step out of marital intimacy as the proper locus and setting for which this beautiful gift is meant to be transmitted, you are attacking not only the beauty and dignity of marriage and the marital act, but also the dignity and the respect that is due to the embryo himself or herself who is being engendered outside of its proper setting. So this is a very, unique vision that the church has espoused from the beginning, has been really the only voice in our world to articulate this with beautiful clarity. You look at the Protestants.
They all gave way to contraception in the 60s.
Absolutely, they caved on this.
They caved.
Yeah. And look, contraception and IVF, the two go together, right?
They do.
I mean, contraception, what is that? It's sex without babies. What's IVF? It's babies without sex. So, once you've done one and kind of caved on one, you have to cave on the other because you've given away the whole store here. So that's where we are. And I regret it, because our Protestant brethren, I wish they were with us on this. It would be such an important bulwark against a society that is just exploiting young humanity right and left through the IVF industry.
That's amazing. Again, it's just much deeper than I was thinking. So, but once you have these frozen embryos, what do we do with them? And aside from the societal demands, like you were saying, if you start adopting these into the womb of generous women, you're creating a monster. You're creating the industry-wise. You're creating this demand. Now you're feeding the beast. It becomes people are going to be shopping for babies based on their genetic makeup. Horrible.
Yeah.
But can you address just the more philosophical point of why is it better to have a freezer unplugged and thawing out these embryos compared to implanting them?
Okay, well, I would first disagree with you that you could ever unplug the freezer. In other words,
well, I'm not even sure I have an opinion, so it's
okay.
I'm not sure you're disagreeing with me.
Oh, okay.
Because I just don't. Yeah, I don't really know what to do. I mean,
right. So, but I think a lot of people will talk about it. Let me just sort of frame it a little bit.
Yeah.
Because they would say something similar to what you said. They would say, well, look, these embryos, they're in liquid nitrogen. They're being maintained this way for a long period of time. Isn't this a lot like somebody who's at the end of life and you've got them hooked up to ventilators and tubes? Isn't the liquid nitrogen extraordinary? Isn't it disproportionate? Shouldn't we discontinue the utilization of this? And I say, oh no, that's a very bad parallel. You've missed the essence of what we mean by extraordinary or disproportionate, because liquid nitrogen is commonly available. It only costs maybe $300 to $400 a year to keep your children frozen. So I'm going to just go right to the nub of it.
Yeah.
When I get couples who come to me and they say, look, 10 years ago we did IVF. We were Catholic, but we were told it was okay to do it. Now we've studied this, we realize we made a huge mistake. We've got 4 frozen embryos left over. They've been sitting there for 10 years in the freezer. What do we do with them?
Oh my gosh.
And we get these questions.
That's a terrible question for you. I mean, that's a hard pastoral. I mean, it's a beautiful question, but
hard question.
It's terrible in the sense of
deep
hard.
Tragedy,
Yeah.
and deep regret written all over their forehead as they're sharing this. You know. So, maybe just to go through, a couple of options here. First, and obviously, I hope this is obvious to all your listeners, you can never hand over your embryonic children to stem cell researchers who would destroy the embryos to get cells to make cures. Now, it sounds nice, sounds glamorous. You're thinking, oh, nothing, we can't do anything with our embryos. They've been there 10 years. I don't want them to sit there forever, so let's get some good out of it. No. You don't ever hand over your kids for vivisection, which is what's actually at the root of that. Okay, so just to kind of put that to the side so we're clear. Never sacrifice. No human sacrifices here are allowed. Does the analogy that I mentioned earlier work with disproportionate means? And if not, why not? It doesn't work because first, when you have children, and I know you have, a number of them yourself, there are parental duties that extend to your kids. You got to feed them, you got to put a roof over their head, you got to pay for education. All this comes out, hundreds of thousands of dollars sometimes, right? At least in the U.S.
It's true.
If you live here, it's pretty darn expensive.
It is.
Yeah, and you got to do that. So now you've got several kids in the freezer. Can't send them to college. Can't put clothes on them. Can't put a roof over their head, except in the sense that they're in that liquid nitrogen cryopreservation container, and that's only $300 a year. And you're telling me you can't pay that? You're telling me that's somehow extraordinary or disproportionate burden to you? I'm not buying it.
Wow.
So the people who come to us, the people who come to me, I will often say, there does not appear, regrettably, to be any simple answer here. Now, hopefully we can go into the whole discussion of why I believe you cannot do the embryo adoption or donate them to other people. But you can't just thaw them out. You've got to care for them. And what I say to people is, you should, if I were in your situation, if I were the father of those very embryos, those 4 embryos that you're telling me about, I would honestly set up a trust fund, small trust fund of some kind, with some money in it, so that if I suddenly die, my embryos are still. Now, why? Why would I do that? Because I regret the fact that I made those 4 embryos. I deeply regret. I bitterly regret it. And as a sign and kind of a token of real penance, Even though it's an effort that can't continue forever, I want to care for my kids. They're my kids in the freezer. And I'm going to dedicate this money and put it aside. And then if I do die, they'll be cared for at least a little while longer. And then I don't know what will happen. As a sign of my repentance before the Lord that I did this and trapped my kids in this way. People don't like that answer. How long should I say, look, that's between you and God. You reflect on it. You pray about it. But I'm telling you, that's what I would do if I were in your situation.
That's unbelievable. Like, of course, that's what I would do if I was in that situation. I had never considered that. I thought it was kind of like a implant him or thaw him, you know?
Yeah.
But if I put myself in that shoe as a dad, and you're saying you got kids in the freezer, like when I hear that, I'm gonna trust exactly what you said. I'm gonna set up a trust fund.
Yes.
So that those kids can go as long as they can.
They're precious.
Yes. I can't
yours.
pull the plug. I cannot pull the plug because these are not people
Precisely.
who have reached gone through the natural course of the dying process. Right?
They're at the very beginning.
In the very beginning.
Yeah.
This is not like my kid who's on, all the machines at the end of life.
Right. No parallel.
No, there's no parallel. You're right. I kind of.
Yeah.
Man, you changed my mind. You really did. I mean,
I'm glad to hear.
I'm not even sure. No, I'm not even saying that it's changed my mind because I don't know that.
Yeah, maybe you didn't have an opinion.
I thought there was two options, and I thought you leaned that it was better. I mean, I thought it was like the lesser of two evils. That you lean towards thawing.
No, because look, think about it. If we unplug, that's an act. It is a human choice. I unplug.
Which you don't have to.
Right, and then I am making a decision, and I'm going to be really blunt here, to be the one who slays my own offspring by unplugging. I know what it's going to cause. I know what it's going to result in. It's 100% clear that as that happens and the freezer's turned off, well, it's not freezer, it's liquid nitrogen, but as the liquid nitrogen evaporates, my kids are going to thaw out and they cannot survive. They will die because I made a specific act, a specific choice. Wow. So there's moral gravity involved here. Now, this is interesting because I'm just going to throw this as a sidelight. Yeah. There was an article in the New York Times many years ago, and it was called "The Job at the Fertility Clinic That Nobody Wants." You know what that job was? Unplugging. Because when the time came, and especially in places like Great Britain.
Yeah, it's when you think about it.
Yeah. In Great Britain,
awful.
They had a law that said if parents don't claim their embryos after 5 years in the freezer, they have to be thawed out and destroyed. Now, when the 5 years would come up, all the people in the clinic would say, "Oh, we're at 5 years." And then the boss, the owner of the clinic, would say to the employee, "You go do it." And I don't want to do that. He'd pass it off to I don't know, and it just got back. And finally, the owner of the place had to do it. Now, why? Because every one of those workers at that IVF clinic, they knew. Those were children. If we take them and implant them, we're going to have beautiful, bubbly babies. We're going to have life emanating here. This is so clear what it is. And you're asking me to become the active agent that destroys them? No, thank you. So this is natural law.
It's natural law written on their heart.
Written on their hearts.
They know
everyone can see it.
They feel like they're
plain as day.
They feel like they're delivering a lethal injection.
Yes.
I mean, that's what they feel like. They feel like they're the executioner.
Absolutely. And so they all back off. They are. They would be if they agreed to it. And God bless them for not agreeing to it.
I just thought that what this was like these are two terrible decisions. You implant or you thaw, and it's better to implant. Better to thaw than to implant. But I guess what you're saying is that's not necessarily the question.
Right. In other words, that's presented as a false dichotomy. Only two options. Actually, there's a third option, which is let's continue to care in the best way that we can for our kids. Now, it's not ideal. No. I mean, it's awkward. No, it's terribly awkward. Yeah. And the couples always say that to me, and they're right. But it's like, that's all you can do. That's all we've got. We backed ourselves into a corner here, and certain actions that we choose have, in my opinion, when they're gravely wrong, they have an irreversible aspect. So let me just say a little more about that, because this will tie in, I think, with the embryo adoption question too. All right, you have a man, married man, with kids, and one day he goes off and he commits adultery. and the wife finds out. This comes back home, has huge repercussions. Maybe the kids find out, at least the older kids. Divorce happens. People don't talk to each other. And then, the man who did this, the husband, regrets it bitterly. And he wants to clean up the mess. The reality is there is something of an irreversible character here that has happened because of the gravity of the wrongdoing. And, there may be forgiveness that could come on the part of the wife. There may be, forgiveness from children. But the reality is it's not going to be like it was before he crossed that line. You have a woman who has an abortion. I know so many women who, what they would give if they could undo their abortion. But they can't. They know they can't. There is something irreversible. The gravity of what they chose did not permit for any kind of reversibility here. I am convinced in vitro fertilization, because it always involves grave matter, is of exactly the same caliber. Once we back ourselves into some of these corners, we end up with, extra embryos, or as you pointed out, millions of embryos, ongoing humanitarian tragedy around the globe, expanding every day in every major city, assembly line production. And we're in a situation where that cannot be reversed, cannot be undone. And so people say, well, what about embryo adoption? I mean, this seems like this might partially reverse it. And so again, I always say, first thing, stop the assembly line, because, it's not going to do anything. It's going to be a tiny little Band-Aid. You have massive industry, just spewing out tens or hundreds of thousands of embryos a day. You're not going to be making even a dent once you start doing embryo adoptions. But the broader question here becomes, is it allowable? Is it licit? And what has the church said about this? So, if you'll let me, maybe I'll say a little bit about it. Because it's an interesting question. Yeah. So I wrote a paper with Dr. John Haas, our former president, as you and I were talking.
I referred to as a legend.
A legend, truly a legend in bioethics, an incredible thinker. And he, the first part of the paper he wrote, and he made the point, look, if you read at least two major church documents on this, it's really pretty hard to come away from those documents and say, embryo adoption is fine. And those two documents, one of them is Donum Vitae, on the gift of life. And the second one is called Dignitas Personae.
Yeah, I had notes on that one.
That one is, the well-known one. Yeah. And so both of those documents, in the first one, it talks about embryos being exposed to an absurd fate, which offers no resolution or something. The language is something like that, offers no resolution. And now people say, well, it wasn't written specifically to address the question of embryo adoption. But, Benedict was behind this. Ratzinger in those days when he was running the CDF, he was major author of this. And I think he wrote it, and it should be taken at face value. He had thought this through. It wasn't like he hadn't considered the option that embryos could be transferred to others, in a form of surrogacy. No, he's saying, look, this is an absurd fate that we have condemned these embryos to. There's nothing that can be done. Now, so that was the first, the oldest document that I think puts the kibosh on the idea that we can do embryo adoption. The second one, Dignitas Personae, I think it's section 19, basically says outright in the first part, you may not do embryo adoption as a remedy for infertility. Period. Full stop. We can't do it as a remedy for infertility. How interesting. We can't ever do it. All right, so the church has said something here. Now, the problem is that in the next line after that, it goes on and it says, well, but there is this proposal that, maybe to rescue embryos and so on, we could, facilitate and so on. And I said, but this raises difficulties not dissimilar to the previous. And so some people say, well, not dissimilar. I forget the exact language, but they read it as, there's some tiny little loophole here that's going to allow us to, drive the Mack truck through and start this as if it were allowable. And I'm convinced, and Dr. Haas is convinced, and we wrote this paper together, that no, just read the church documents, kind of as they are, prima facie. It's pretty obvious and apparent here that this is not a proposal. And then there are all the other complications that we already alluded to.
So it's not the mind of the church. Like, I'm convinced those documents say that, but why? Like,
Yes.
what's their rationale? So we got 2 documents that are not encyclicals, right?
Right.
They're from the
CDF.
CDF.
Yeah, the old CDF.
I almost said CDC.
Yeah, it's DDF now.
Oh, it is?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
dicastery
That's
for the
right,
doctrine instead of the congregation. But.
So we got 2 documents that we could easily, by analogy, apply to this embryonic adoption, right? I mean, so...
Well, not by analogy.
The second one actually deals with it, but it outlaws it for
infertility
purposes, but you got to take an extra step because the next provision says
yes,
similar problems
yes,
for any situation of...
appears to, sort of broaden
right.
outside of infertility contexts.
Right.
And this does, and so you want to know rationale?
Yeah, well, rationale is
the documents refer. Let me just see if I recall specific. Oh yeah, one argument is that it involves something akin to surrogacy.
Yeah,
and the church is very clear that surrogacy is not allowed. So, and it really does when you stop and think about this. You're taking a non-genetically related embryo, implanting it into another woman who has volunteered to receive it, perhaps together even with her husband. And now you can say, well, what's the wrongness of surrogacy? Is it the fact that this transaction sometimes involves payment? So for the woman to carry the embryo, you pay her. And that's what happens. We have all kinds of communities in India where the women are paid to carry embryos that are FedExed to them from the US or Israel or, other first world countries.
Gosh.
So they're all turned into just sort of gestational, carriers.
Right. But that's not the surrogacy in and of itself.
Well, but that's the question. So what constitutes the essence of surrogacy here? And this I think is still somewhat of a debated topic, because you could say, is it the fact that the surrogacy means that because the embryo is genetically not the mom's, that anytime you do something like that, that's what we mean by surrogacy, any type of implantation? So what if you had a woman who is implanting one of her own embryos? Is that not a case of surrogacy? And most people would say, well, it doesn't seem like it is. I, on the other hand, in the minority, would say that I believe the essence of surrogacy also includes that latter case. In other words, I see 2. Now, the church hasn't said this, okay? This is my own view on this. I want to be clear, my own perspective. But I believe there are actually 2 wrongs that are committed in every typical act of IVF. Wrong number 1 is that first we create the life in the petri dish, in glass.
I see that.
The second is that we do an act of extrinsic or extraneous implantation of that embryo into the woman, making her pregnant, completely apart from the reality of a marital act with her husband.
And this is why the woman who comes to you and says, "Hey, we did in vitro years ago. I got frozen kids." This is why she can't implant them in herself, even if she was still young.
Well, that's my opinion.
But some people disagree with you.
Many people disagree with me.
That she could implant her own kids
into her. Yes, many people would say, "Oh, she can definitely do that."
But you're impregnating her but your point is she's impregnating herself without her husband.
Correct. That this is a technician who's doing it typically. And even if you did the crazy scenario, saying, "Well, have her husband implant them," it's like, no, that's not how husbands and wives become pregnant and engender new life in God's plan.
Yeah,
it's by that body-to-body self-giving.
You're stuck with this irreconcilable problem, and you just got to live with
you've
that.
Backed
and
yourself.
that's part of your penance.
It's irreversible.
That's part of your penance.
Yes, it's part of the weight that you carry.
Yeah.
Now, let me just tell you a story about this, because I talked to a woman one time in Boston. We were filming some footage for something on IVF, and she volunteered to come in. She had done IVF, regretted it, with her husband many years earlier. And she said, I have 4 or maybe 7 embryos. I forget how many she had. But every year, on the anniversary of the date that we went to the clinic and they made those embryos, I pick up the phone and I call the clinic and I say, "My name is such and so. Do you have my embryos? Will you go and check that my embryos are okay?" And she said, this is such a difficult thing. I live with this in an ongoing way. And she, you know what she said, which really surprised me? She said, in one sense, this is even worse than an abortion. Because in an abortion, it's over and done. It never goes away. This just tracks with you all the time, the weight, the burden of the bad choice that you made. And, you know, so I understand that. And we should be sympathetic.
Yeah, very. I feel awful,
supportive.
I'm sitting here thinking about it. If I was, when we were talking about this 10 minutes ago, I would, if I had kids in a freezer somewhere in California or something, I think I'd be like getting on a plane and going and visiting them. I mean, once you start thinking that you have quote unquote kids in a freezer, if you really believe that this soul is made in the image and likeness of God,
yes, this human being there,
it's awful. It's awful. This is so barbaric. This is barbarians in a laboratory.
Everyone is promoting IVF. Trump passed, an executive order. It's all very sad.
He really let me down on that one.
Yeah. You know? There's much work here to be done to enlighten consciences.
Okay, so I'm getting really kind of technical here.
Yeah.
So the implanting into a surrogate, implanting period, is wrong in your opinion because it is unnatural. It's doing the marital act without the spouse.
Well, let me maybe frame it in a broader context for a moment, and then we can kind of zoom in a little bit too. I think what's happened in the biosciences is we have acquired a set of tools, and we can manipulate sperm and egg, and we can mix them together, and we can create embryos, and we can store embryos, and we can test embryos, and we can do this and do that. And we get very kind of what I would call punctate. Oh, you put the sperm and the egg together, boom, new life. And we're thinking all the time in this kind of, oh, here's the moment, here's this, here's that. And we even do it, with respect to just sort of the discussions around conception and so on. And some of those, of course, are valid, although there's even some complexity there. But what I think we have to do in order to enter into the moral discernment around the goods that are at stake here is to see and appropriate correctly the broad designs over our human sexuality, and to recognize that, for example, the state of being pregnant is not just another punctate moment. You have fertilization here, and then you have embryo transfer, and then you have pregnancy, and then you have... No. The way this really works is you have the beauty of the one flesh union, which is a complete bodily surrender of one spouse to another, the mystery of which is that after that surrender has occurred, you don't even know whether you're pregnant.
Yeah.
You've got to wait a while before you can do the first pregnancy test.
Yeah.
Even. You have no clue.
Yeah.
And in the mystery of that surrender, maybe the gift arrives, and you hope it does. So there's a continuity here where it is that entire, if you will, kind of spectrum or continuity is opened up by the reality of the marital act at the beginning. And then, if the conception has occurred, the egg is released from the woman's ovary, it moves into the fallopian tube. The sperm typically joins in the fallopian tube. That's where most conceptions occur. Then the embryo moves, there are little hairs inside that move it along, moves down, implants in the uterus of the woman. And then a little bit later, she's aware she's pregnant. And then, the pregnancy continues, and you have this kind of continuity that goes all the way up to birth. I consider that to be kind of I call it like procreative, gestative unity.
Yeah, I see that. I see.
And this is designed by God. This was set in motion. It's a whole continuity that has a moral meaning that God wants us to respect the design there. And part of the reason for this is that when you surrender in that way and you bring life into the world, that life is received mysteriously as a gift, as something that you don't control, you don't preponderate over, you don't dictate whether the life comes. You are a complete reality of receptivity in the mystery. Versus in the IVF clinic, we're the masters.
They're gods. They're gods,
and the parents too. I will pay as many tens of thousands. I will provide sperm as many times. She says, I'll be super ovulated to give eggs, as many as we need. We're going to empty our bank account. We're in a pragmatic, can-do American mentality. We're going to make this happen. You see how different the dynamic? One is pure receptivity to the gift, and one is demanding and saying, I'm going to make this happen at any cost. This is our project, etc. So
it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
This is a very loose analogy, and maybe you'll hate this, and maybe it's wrong in a lot of ways. But I've learned in the West, we have in the liturgy, we have a very clear idea of exactly when transubstantiation occurs. But in the East, in their liturgy of the Eucharist, they're not as crystal clear when transubstantiation happens. It's more of a process,
right? And
isn't
that interesting?
It is, and it's that a number of things are required. The different prayers, and they don't have a clear statement of when it happens. But as you were explaining this beautiful symphonic unfolding of this beautiful, all these beautiful things are happening like a symphony. I'm just and the mystery of God is infusing that process, and we should not interrupt the process.
Yes.
It's like cutting out half the instruments in the symphony or something. A weird analogy, but but I can see with the East their understanding of when the Lord becomes present. It's not so black and white, like boom, we just said that magic word. It's a little bit different, and I don't want to denigrate the West's understanding of the transubstantiation.
Precise. No, I kind of like it, and maybe I'll just dovetail a little example onto the side of it to see how I like that, how I think it fits partly in the discussion of fertilization. So when you have a sperm join an egg, there's this sort of, when does the human being begin? When does it really begin? Now, if you read German law states that when you have the fusion of the pronuclei, one pronucleus from the sperm, one from the egg. So the sperm attaches, opens up, one nucleus moves, the other moves, and the nuclei fuse. Upon the fusion of the pronuclei, you have the new human being.
Okay.
All right, so that's the German law.
Well, Germans are very...
They are.
Like that.
They are. They like the clear lines.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
But, you can always say, well, wait a minute, that seems, why do we pick a point like that?
Yeah.
And so you could push it back earlier and say, well, no, wouldn't it be the situation where maybe the two bigger cells, the sperm and the egg cell, not the nuclei, but the whole cells are fusing. And once they've fused or started to fuse, but then you can also push it a little bit further back. And something very interesting happens if you actually study the biology. When you have a woman's egg, and eggs are huge, they're the largest cell in the body. The sperm is tiny. It comes when it touches the plasma membrane. It'll sit there for a little bit, and there's something on the head of the sperm called the acrosome, which releases this like flood of enzymes, and those enzymes start eating away at the woman's plasma surrounding of the egg.
So it can get in.
So it can get in. Starts to digest
it. Starts digging a hole in there.
Almost. So, and what happens is when that begins, this triggers what's called a membrane depolarization. And there's this electrical signal that gets sent all around her egg, which shuts the door on any other sperm.
Amazing.
Getting in. Isn't that incredible?
It's incredible.
Yeah. So just to wrap up that thought, I think I would be comfortable with saying, when have you pushed the equilibrium such that, yes, we've crossed the real line here and now set the whole chain of events in motion to leading to the adult taxpayer? Well, it was at the depolarization.
Wow.
When that happened. Because you can have other sperm that'll attach and just sit there and do nothing. But once you've depolarized it, the whole thing, everything starts, and then the pronuclei, then it divides, the cell becomes 2, 4, 8, 16, 32.
The liturgy of the Eucharist began.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a kind of, distinct point like the West, but then there's also this sort of smoothness.
Yeah.
That's the underlying.
It's beautiful. And philosophically as humans, we need to have a respect more for process and not be like engineers all the time.
I agree. And so getting back to the embryo adoption thing, I really do think that the proper understanding of our sexuality has to be sort of integrated over the course of the entire series of events, and not treat pregnancy as this discrete, separable reality that we can turn women into incubators, surrogates, whenever we want, because we have a good reason. We've got millions of poor embryos over here, and it's horrible that they're there. No, we can't do that, because what that does is a kind of dissociation, and it violates motherhood, and it violates fatherhood. Now, let me just stretch a little here and point out why I think fatherhood is violated.
Tan Books is here to help you become a saint. That's why we do everything we do. We publish thousands of titles, literally, that are specifically written to help you get to heaven. Everything from the lives of the saints to the writings of the saints, the greatest doctors of the church, the great spiritual masters, Alphonsus Liguori, St. Francis de Sales, and so on. So please come to tanbooks.com and find the book that God wants you to have right now so that you can get to heaven and be a saint for eternity.
So in normal cases, what is a father's connection to his own children? It's the marital act. That's pretty much it. The deposition of semen into the vagina. That's it. And then the rest of the 9 months, she does all the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
You know, she's eating, she's nourishing, she's giving birth at the end, the whole 9 yards. So now you turn to embryo adoption and you say, all right, somebody's going to implant her. What happens to the father? He stands on the sidelines. He's barely a spectator as somebody else is impregnating his wife. This is, clearly outside any real understanding of fatherhood.
He was just a donor.
He wasn't even that, because this is a stranger's embryo.
Stranger. Oh, okay. Yeah, this
we're
is
implanting it from the freezer, from somebody else who left
This isn't
over.
just like in vitro with spouses.
Exactly.
This is a stranger.
The actual embryo adoption step. So the fatherhood, there's no fatherhood. Now motherhood, again, the woman's, the sort of invoking of her gestative powers should only occur, in my opinion, through her husband. Through marital acts, through marital intimacy with him and him alone. There's no other way in which those gestative, meaning being pregnant, powers should be invoked. To do so in any other form, I am convinced, is sinful, always sinful. Now, that's my opinion. The church has not taught that. I want to be clear, and I've written on this extensively, a number of monographs, but I think the arguments are strong here. But as you point out, there's debate. I will be doing a debate on this in Indiana in probably, 4 or 5 months. Really? Yeah, against another priest who thinks it is allowable. Should be interesting to see how it goes.
Oh, man.
I
want to buy ringside tickets. Let's go, Kevin. We're going. All right. So I very much appreciate the idea of it's not proper to simply splice apart this long, beautiful process, God-ordained process, and look at like each individual thing as if it's good or bad in and of itself.
Right.
I see it. However, can we splice apart the actual issue of an embryo being raised in a surrogate womb that's not its mother, and if you were to look at it isolated, again, taken out of the process, because this is all my mind really thought about. I wasn't thinking about it, holistically like you've done, but I was thinking that it's wrong for an embryo, or unnatural for an embryo or a child to develop essentially in an artificial womb, a womb that God did not plan for this child to be raised in. At the same time, there's adoption, where kids are brought into families that weren't theirs naturally. So help me with that.
Yeah. So this is very important, and it's a great question. I think there is a absolutely huge difference between standard adoption of an already born child,
of course, yeah,
and the embryo adoption proposal.
Yeah, and I wasn't even suggesting that. I'm clearly there's a difference.
Yeah,
but it's just like the answer when somebody says, well, it's unnatural for them to be raised in a womb that's not their mother's. Well, somebody, a skeptic, if I was playing devil's advocate, I'd say, well, this child wasn't it's not natural for them to be raised in a family that's not their family. So
right, but
it's just by analogy. So.
Yeah, I don't think it's a good naturalness argument. I think there's a temptation sometimes, I think, for us as Catholics to try to define what's natural and what's not. I think it's more here that I think I would phrase it differently, that the question becomes rather, in a standard adoption scenario with a born child, must I transgress actively any fundamental goods by doing the adoption? And look, if the circumstances is, I happen to have two sisters who are my natural twin sisters, and I have two others who are adopted. My parents adopted them when their Mexican-American parents both died.
Wow.
Those circumstances around which an adoption would occur are often something like that. And it's like, well, we have option one, which is kind of put the kids out on the street.
Oh, it's terrible.
Right. Or
adoption is beautiful.
It's a beautiful, wonderful thing.
Which is why you're tempted to say it's beautiful to adopt in the womb.
Well, but let's go a little further, because I want to just conclude the point, which is that in order to do this, I am not actively transgressing any objective moral lines. Think of a slightly different case. Think of a case where you have a couple that has 4 children living in China, and for some reason the communists come in and they say, you're not allowed to have 4 kids, you're only allowed to have 2. We are forcibly taking 2 of your children and we're going to give them to another couple that has none. Are you transgressing any objective moral lines? Yes, you are. The Communist Party is.
Yes.
And the agents who come and enforce this are doing a serious wrong. Okay? That, in my opinion, is more parallel to the situation of the embryo adoption.
Wow.
Because the question becomes,
of course,
whenever you do embryo adoption, must I transgress objective goods? And the answer is yes, because I must instrumentalize a part of the generative capacity of the woman. I must instrumentalize her ability to gestate and carry a pregnancy, turn her into a form of an incubator for a stranger's embryo. And that, I am convinced, represents crossing a line, a transgression of an objective sort. So therefore, one cannot go there. And therefore, there's a lack of parallelism between the case of just, the voluntary adoption where the parents died, and you're making the best of situations. You don't just throw the kids out on the street, and you're not transgressing any objective goods. So that's what's important. There's a lack of parallelism between those two examples. People like say, a woman should be able to give over her womb, to do this. It's an act of charity. It's an act of generosity. And just to weave in one other angle, say, well, a woman can offer to be a wet nurse for other children who don't have a... Seems like that's the same thing.
I had that note to ask you.
Did you?
I don't believe that, but I could see people bringing that question
They
up.
do. And I think the problem here is that we have to recognize, and this is getting back to the integrity of what we were discussing before of this entire process, there is a unique interiority to the baby-mother relationship. It is a deep interiority. It is a kind of involvement of both bodies, a body in body, that is not parallel in any other way to anything else that's out there. And meanwhile, breastfeeding, you're talking about a situation where the child has been born, and now, because the child is no longer in that interiority and that unique setting of one inside the other, the child is available for other relational encounters, including other wet nurses if there's a need for that, etc.
Yeah.
And of course, women have 2 breasts, so they can, do several children, couple of children at a time, etc. So the order there, you have to. There's something very, I am convinced, special and privileged about that entire procreative, generative unity that leads to the threshold of birth for the baby. Prior to that, there is something very sacrosanct that we have to be very careful that it's at our own peril that we go in there and start, slicing and dicing and deciding that we're going to be using subparts of it for our particular agendas.
Yeah, amazing. Now, another question I had about these frozen embryos, do they even if you keep them frozen, do they like degrade over time?
Yeah,
I think I read that somewhere.
Right. I actually wrote a column where, I said the situation of having the couples pay, and set up the trust fund and all that, it's awkward. But I said, if one does that, the question is there some decline over time? And it does appear that there might be. It depends partly on protocols that are used for how you freeze the embryos, and those have changed over the years. I think they've gotten better with time. So now it's likely we're going to be able to store embryos for even longer without decay. Yeah. But look, when you're in the liquid nitrogen, it's extremely cold. Most molecular movement ceases. But I said most. There is still an occasional, twitch, little slight movement that may occur of some molecular species in the embryos. Get enough of those over enough time, over maybe 1,000 years, or 10,000 years, I don't know how long, they are likely to decay. Now, what I think would be a worthwhile...
But it could be that long. It could be like 1,000 years.
We don't know.
Wow.
But what I would propose, and I hope somebody is going to do this experiment, somebody who works in primatology, take embryos of monkeys or orangutans, which are very similar to ours, freeze them, and then freeze a lot of them, huge number, and then every 20 years go in and test them and thaw them and see how many of them, when we thaw them, are deceased, and see if the numbers go down, if they're dying in the deep freeze. And I suspect they would be, probably slowly. So, there might be an argument here. Look, if we could stop the big assembly line machinery that's generating human embryos in every major city in the United States, just put the kibosh on it right away, then what do we do with all the embryos? Well, we take care of them, and we figure out what does that curve look like based on the orangutans. And if, let's say it is 10,000 years. Wait 10,000 years, and at the end of 10,000 years, we say we have high degree of certainty that all these embryos in this tank have already died.
Right.
Just thaw them out and give them a decent burial.
That's another beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people have little burials for their miscarriages.
Yes.
I mean, we do.
Yes.
We got a Marian statue in our front yard.
Yep. Some of my
made
sisters
a little coffin.
as well. It's beautiful.
My wife, she's had her miscarriages, and she's each time. I mean, if you include twins, we have 5. And she cut a little piece of her wedding dress off.
Oh, wow.
For each one.
How beautiful.
Yeah. And then they're just wrapped up in that and put in Tupperware.
Family plot.
Yeah. And then we put them in Tupperware, and then we put them in I made like a wooden box, and we've added to it. And it's buried underneath our Marian statue. I mean, but you don't know what else to do.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes, and that's wonderful. And I mean,
we try to be as reverent as we can, and right. I don't know what else to do.
And it brings beautiful closure, which I think is healthy and good. As I said, for that woman who did IVF, closure is much harder. Miscarriages, with God's grace, one can work slowly towards a closure.
Yeah.
But I think
and these miscarriages were super early.
Tiny, yes.
And
sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're later.
I know.
And those are harder.
And those are harder.
Yes.
And that's when I think a lot of people go and actually go to a Catholic cemetery or something. And I've had a lot of, I know Bellman Abbey down the street here, they've allowed more developed miscarriages to be
yes,
to be
and
buried.
some hospitals will have special plots
where
they will bury all of them.
You just try.
One day a year, special dedicated. They'll have a priest there. So that's.
But I've told I've had friends ask. I had a cousin ask me. I was like, "What do you do?" And I was like, "Don't flush down the toilet. Like treat this with as dignity. Much dignity as you can.
Yes.
And he's like, "I asked my pastor, and he has no idea what to do." I'm like, "Well, then." Just try your best, buddy. I mean, just do something beautiful and reverent, and bury the child.
Yes.
So, and it doesn't matter if you can't see body parts. I mean, it's a human. It's really small, but it's a human.
We all looked that way one time ourselves.
Yeah. So, anyway, is there anything else on the embryonic adoption? Because I know you've had a lot in your mind, but is there anything else you want to get out?
Yeah. I think probably not. I mean, I think there might be one or two other, kind of common arguments that are out there that try to justify it.
Yeah.
But I typically find them to be lacking much in the way of what usually happens in those arguments. It goes something like this: well, isn't it a tragedy? Don't we all feel horrible that there are all of these orphaned embryos? And, don't we have a duty to do something for them? And that's really strong language. It's like being pro-life people, we want to say, of course we have a duty to do something for them. But the question is, how do you identify what is the duty that we have? And we have to be sure that what we're calling maybe a duty to carry out is not actually going to involve us in some kind of new transgression or wrongdoing or crossing an objective line. So that's where I believe that there hasn't been clear thinking to the degree that there needs to be. There's a kind of emotional pull of the tragedy of the embryo. And I say to people, look, take your emotions and direct them towards the industry and get some laws like they have in Italy and Germany. In those countries, whenever you do IVF, they passed laws a number of years back that said you may produce only 3 embryos. They must all be implanted. You're not allowed to freeze them. You're not allowed to experiment on them. You're not allowed to hand them over to embryonic stem cell researchers. They must all be implanted. So in Italy and Germany, they hardly have any frozen embryos.
Yeah. Wow.
You mentioned how many are in Spain. Spain does not have a law like that.
UK, 500,000.
Exactly. It's we call this the Wild West of infertility.
Yeah.
There's no regulation. And so, this is an area where I think let our emotions and our anger be directed towards those kinds of sensible laws and towards reining in the industry, because there's only one golden rule that drives the entire infertility industry. If it makes gold, it's good.
Oh.
That's the golden rule.
Yeah.
There's no regulation to speak of except what they call the much vaunted self-regulation. Yeah. So I think that's the real thing, is for us to, parse this in a sensible fashion, say to ourselves, we should be upset about the fact that there are so many embryos trapped, but the only logical next step for us should be directed against the industry, reining them in and bringing a stop to the horrible assembly line that's going on.
You got a little bit energy left in you for me to ask a few other questions? Changing topics a little bit?
Okay, let's do.
All right, and I don't want to say rapid fire, not that, but we can just kind of skim these if you'd like.
Yes, okay.
But, because I could listen to you all day. Organ donation.
Yes.
Now, I thought that's a nice thing to do. But then I learned that sometimes people aren't dead when they start harvesting organs. Is that for real? Like, help me with this. Where are you on organ donation?
So organ donation, Pope John Paul II was very clear, as you said initially, that the decision to be an organ donor is a generous act, and it can be freely chosen. It should not be forced, or there should not be what the Europeans do, which is called implied consent. So you get in a car accident, you die. In Europe, they can just take your organs because you gave implied consent.
Yeah, I don't like that.
No. That's not proper ethically. What there needs to be is explicit consent. So maybe you write up your a short living will and you put in there, I do want to be an organ donor.
Well, it's on my license. Like they ask
or
you in your license, yes or no. It's a little heart, I think, if you're an organ donor.
So you give explicit consent. Right. So that is a generous act. By the Holy Father,
which I'm not an organ donor. I used to be, and then my wife was kind of convinced me otherwise. So I'm not, because I've heard about these kind of scandalous things, and also I hope this thing's glorified one day. I want this body glorified. I don't know how
don't worry
know how that factors into it.
That's not a problem. I sometimes use a simple story to remind people. Look, when Maximilian Kolbe died at Auschwitz, what did they do afterwards? They took his body, they put it in a chimney. Burned. His ashes are spread all over Europe.
Yeah.
So don't worry about missing an organ. He was missing everything. And God will bring him back 100.0%. Yeah. He'll bring you back 100.0 if you donate a kidney.
Because being glorified without my kidneys would be weird. You know what I mean? I want the whole thing.
Ain't gonna happen.
I know. So, but haven't you written and spoken about this?
Yes. So the issue of organ donation does presuppose in the situation of unpaired organ donation that you are deceased. So there's a question here. Are proper tests being done to ascertain that an individual has died?
Yeah.
And so that's where it sometimes, not often, but sometimes does appear to get fuzzy.
Yeah.
I tell a story about a physician I know who worked in Florida. He was a good Catholic. He worked at a secular hospital, not a Catholic one. And he said, there are 3 guys who I work with. All 3 of us declare people dead. And, he told me how he did it, and he was, very careful about the criteria and doing all the reflex testing and all the other things to assess, that somebody was genuinely dead or brain dead, depending which one. I mean, if you're dead and your heart is stopped, it's just a matter of waiting till it stops. But if it's brain death, then your heart is still going, and you're being, forcibly having air forced into your lungs because your brain can't trigger breathing anymore because you're deceased. But he said, there's 3 of us who declare death. And there's one guy that whenever he declares it, we all say, better double check.
Oh, gosh.
Now, that doesn't engender a lot of comfort to hear a story like that.
No.
It reminds us that medicine is human.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have, people who aren't as careful about the lines as you wish they would be. And that's a problem of its own.
That's a problem.
Now, there's still some other problems that are related to this. And there's one area of concern that's pretty new, I would say. I mean, it's new and it's old in the sense that it's been being batted around in the pages of ethics journals and medical journals for a couple of decades. But it's this issue that when appropriate testing is done to determine whether the brain has lost all functions, upper and lower, in some instances, there's this very kind of bottom part of your brain called the hypothalamus, and it's connected to your pituitary gland. And it modulates what the pituitary gland can secrete, and it secretes some of its own things that maintain blood pressure, electrolyte balance, some other things that are very important in your body. So sometimes when that part of your brain, that lower part, is not deceased, you can have people who fulfill all the other criteria for brain death. No reflexes, they're not able to regulate their own temperature, maybe. They're not able to do a lot of other things that, they appear to be dead. But just on the ventilator, they can continue to survive. They don't have what's a kind of, because normally what happens is if that part of your brain also is gone, then you can only be on the ventilator for a little while, and then everything kind of comes apart at the seams.
Yeah.
Blood pressure goes crazy, electrolytes get out of balance, everything gets, and pretty soon your heart starts to have arrhythmias, and it stops as well.
Yeah.
So the controversies now that are being looked at involve this question of retained hypothalamic function. Is it important or not? And there's the ANA, let's see, is it ANA American? I'm drawing a blank. There's an agency that is in charge of establishing the criteria for brain death that's used by all the doctors for the testing. And regrettably, they have come out and said, well, you don't really need to worry too much about the hypothalamus.
Oh.
You don't have to pay too much attention. So
They'd rather define death earlier than later.
Yes, and it appears that there, would be then some clinicians, some doctors who, in following that, would potentially take some organs when people are not yet deceased. Now, I don't like to say
violates
this.
the Hippocratic Oath. Do no harm.
Right, and really, everybody understands the dead donor rule, which is a rule that's been since the beginning of transplantation, that the individual does need to be deceased for non-paired organs. So,
right.
So anyway, there are concerns there, but I even as I say that, Conor, I don't want your listeners to say, "Oh, I'm going to revoke because my driver's license agreement or whatever," because I think it's an individual decision, and you have to sort of say to yourself, well, the physicians I know, don't most of them seem trustworthy? Do I trust the system? And maybe, after COVID and some of the things there, people don't trust the system as much as they used to. And doctors are not on as much of a pedestal as they once were. So I understand that. But I think it's an individual judgment or assessment that has to be made whether you want to be an organ donor based on your sense of, the place, the community you're in, the people you deal with. If you're a small community and, you've known some of the doctors and you think they have high degree of integrity and you're not worried about this, by all means, it is a generous act to be that organ donor. And you'd go ahead and, designate that on your driver's license.
Okay, nicely said. Different topic real quick. Transhumanism. Elon Musk comes out with chips, basically stick it in a paralyzed guy's brain. He's got like Bluetooth control over his screen. That looks very good. Looks very convenient, and this is probably some sliding scale of when it becomes immoral, unethical. How do you handle this? Because this is happening.
So transhumanism is the proposal at its heart to develop a post-human reality. In other words, the transhumanists, they kind of look down their noses at all of us. And they say, oh, human beings, well, it's a little bit like
the Borg in Star Trek. Do you remember them?
Yeah.
they're like post-humans. They're half machine, half humans, and they think that.
But it's a little bit. Think of this analogy. Think of the way you and I look maybe a little bit down our noses at the orangutan.
Sure.
Oh, there's just an orangutan. So the transhuman, it's just a human. We're going to come up with something here that's much better. We're going to, turn to cyborgization. We're going to have implants. We're going to do genetic modifications at such a level that we are going to generate an entirely new entity that is post-human.
Yeah.
And this is something, that Nietzsche often aspired towards. He thought, that we needed to kind of go beyond our humanity.
Superman.
Yes.
Ubermensch.
Ubermensch. Yes, the
Yeah.
Ubermensch. So this is, this
and they believe that he was basically immune to morality. He thought it was above it.
Right. He did.
Yeah.
He did. And I think this is a kind of, I would almost say, it's a temptation to play God in that sense that we will create man in our image. The defects that we see in mankind can only be remediated by a transhumanist project, they claim. So, what is the real sort of answer, just to kind of distill it down? I would say it is not transhumanism, especially for Christians. It is transfiguration. We are called to be transfigured by the grace of God and the power of Christ Jesus into a new man with new order and with moral order that runs deep to the core and actually undoes some of these effects of original sin that are so ingrained within us. That is the real human project of greatness, not seeking to, in a sense, throw human beings into the waste bin and create something that supersedes them according to our own lights. And that's what transhumanism is indeed right at its core all about. So, the cyborgization and the computers, it's also a power play to the extent that these modalities give us new power and I can be in charge and I can call the shots. That's also appealing to man who is infected, as you and I both are, by pride. And all of us are, it affects us and touches us always in so many ways.
Yes, that's a beautiful explanation. But we're still going to struggle with like how many enhancements somebody can do. This anti-aging, like these rich guys are obsessed with anti-aging.
Yes.
They're obsessed with it.
They are.
And it's one thing to like.
There's one of them who's taking his son's plasma. Did you see that? And he's injecting it into himself, his blood plasma.
Yeah.
Out of his, 15-year-old son.
Yeah.
Putting it in himself. He's in his 50s, I think.
Yeah. It's nuts.
It's obsession.
So so I don't know if this is just like one of these sliding scales things, like a little bit's okay, too much is bad.
Well, I would frame it like this, that they're desiring something good, aren't they? They're desiring immortality. Now, it's a good thing to desire immortality, but you've got to desire it within the context where it can achieve an authenticity and realization, and that's only in Christ Jesus our Lord.
Well, yeah, but I can get a heart transplant someday. I can get a lung transplant.
You can go through
someday.
all of that.
I can
but look,
go all this. But
you can still step in front of the bus even after you've done all of that.
Yeah, sure, for sure.
Run over, and even with all those enhancements, you're still not going to.
But I just can't. I do grapple with the question of like, all right, what if medicine keeps us alive for 200 years? Is that bad?
Well, it's going to make certain things very complex. I mean, you look at aging societies like Japan, and already you see there's a huge imbalance of elderly, and there's not enough people to care for them.
Yes, Social Security is going to be really messed up if I live to 200.
Precisely.
Of course, I had 16 kids, so there should be plenty to take care of.
Well, that's true. That's a very upside. That's wonderful. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, you're right. If you live to 200, things are going to be out of kilter. And, can we adjust to that? Can we adjust to greater longevity? I think we can to a point. But I also think there's likely to be some practical limits. We may be able to push it to 120, 130. I have a friend who she is now 103, and I swear she is so sharp, no decay of any. She's an Italian teacher. She's still teaching Italian classes to a whole group of students every week. And just so some people have a lot of the right genes, a lot of perhaps the right lifestyle choices that they've made that allow for extra longevity. But even with that, the reality still is that the oldest person, I think was at 122, something like that. And that's the number of people in the entire world who are over the age of 110 is less than 1,000.
Wow.
Now, to get above 100, there's lots of them. But to get above 110, not easy.
Right. Yeah. Wow.
Almost nobody does it.
Last question. When, as a bioethicist, but you're a theologian too. You're a lot of things. But as a bioethicist, does the subject of AI come into your world? Do you think about that? And what are your thoughts of where we are, where we're going? If we have artificial general intelligence, AGI, and these machines look like they have emotions, and we have data from Star Trek walking around, but they can shed tears. What do you say about all that? I don't even know if it fits under bioethics.
Well, I think it does, because, as you get a better and better simulacrum of our humanity, a better copy, and you can have robots. I don't know if you've seen some of the robots that they're making now.
Yeah.
That are shaped like humans and look just like humans, and some also goes in this problematic direction of sex robots.
Yeah.
Many problems in these areas. But what if you could have somebody, some entity like that with artificial general intelligence, and then you say, all right, we've got a kind of retirement community where there are a bunch of elderly people and nobody's really visiting them, and we send one of these entities in to talk to them and to carry on conversations and engage them. Now, I think there is a problem there. You could say, well, it's just like the television. You just turn on the TV and everybody sits in front of it and veggies out, or you just send in this robot. But, there's a way in which this robot will be even more engaging, and the person may think, it's so much like a human. And you hear stories about people who, want to marry their robots and, all kinds of other craziness. Yeah. I think there are some bioethical lines here that pertain to how we relate to each other, to our duties to care for each other, and the question of whether substitution that relies heavily on artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence should be, carefully deployed and only in very appropriate types of circumstances. So that's one angle.
Have you talked to chat yet, like with the voice interaction?
No, not with the voice. I haven't done that. I've just done where you type it in.
It's unbelievable. I turned my phone off. But it's unbelievable. But the upgraded versions, I'm telling you, Father, it talks like we talk.
Yes,
I'll show you in the car ride back to the hotel. We're gonna put it on, and I will tell it. I wish I had my phone.
Yeah, I have seen somebody else do it.
I'll say, hey, I can tell this thing. I'll say, hey, chat, Father Tad, the famous bioethicist, is in my car with me. Say hi to him. And he's going to talk to you like there's a guy in the back seat. It's really strange.
That's amazing.
So, I have a dishwasher that washes my dishes. Why can't I have a robot that cuts my grass? And just because it looks like we could put a head and arms on it and he can push the lawnmower, and Chat's already talking nice to me. So if I'm walking through the yard or reading my book as opposed to cutting the grass, why couldn't the robot walk by and say, "Hi, Mr. Gallagher, I hope you're enjoying your book."
Right.
You know what I mean? Is that wrong? I don't know. I don't know. It's so weird. I don't know.
It's certainly, I mean, it's going to take some, I think, getting used to, but I think it's also very likely that we will see more and more scenarios of that sort. But, I think the problem here is partly also a question, how much should our dependence upon this occur? You're aware, I'm sure, of what's called hallucinations in AI.
Yes, it's real.
It's very real.
Yeah, it's actually very aggravating when you're doing research.
Yes, it is. And I've done research using AI, and it's very interesting because I'll put in, a specific request, something very scientific maybe, like tell me the effects of exercise and ketoacidosis on glutamine levels in the blood. All right. And then it gives me like 5 or 6 different statements, A, B, C, D, E. And I look at D and I say, oh, that's an interesting one. And I say, give me a citation for D where you say this about the levels of glutamine in the blood. And then
it'll make something up.
No, surprise. It comes back and it says, oh, I made a mistake. I don't have a reference for that. And it's like, oh, now what if I had gone ahead and used that conclusion that you had given me, maybe even written it up somewhere as part of something I've written? The possibility for and disinformation here is real. And so this need to, I think, verify things and go back to primary sources is really, really important.
You know that the federal court system, I think it's federal or state, I don't know, but some courts have actually put into their rules, which is kind of a big deal, that says lawyers must certify. They must actually sign a document now that says human eyes read every document filed with the court.
Interesting.
Because of the hallucination. AI's writing complaints, and I'm telling you, Father, they're making up citations. They are saying the Supreme Court ruled in 1978, boom, and they give a quote, and it's all bogus.
Yes.
But it looks totally convincing.
Now, you're a book publisher, as we are at the National Catholic Bioethics Center, so you've probably had to deal with this as well. Do you accept manuscripts that are partially or mostly written by AI?
It's a struggle.
Yeah, we've decided not to.
Yeah, but I mean, it's like, so like, what's partially mean?
Yes.
Word check. Word. What's it in Microsoft Word? Spell check. Spell check. Well, that's sort of AI, and it catches spelling errors. We've been doing that forever.
Or proofreads.
Proofreading, right?
But I think then also some of these things that check for plagiarism.
Yes.
And the question here of what is plagiarism, the lines start to blur.
Yeah, I'm just saying, if when you really get into it, it's kind of like when you get into some heavy-duty bioethics. The use of it's a tool that people are going to use. The question is to what extent?
Yes.
I mean, when does that creative process no longer theirs? And every high school teacher in the world is dealing with this because the kids are handing in.
Absolutely. And we at the Bioethics Center, if an author submits a manuscript to us and he makes it clear in the notations as part of the manuscript, that we relied upon AI for a number of sections here, our tendency is to decline.
No, I wouldn't accept that.
Yeah.
As a publisher, no, I wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
But I also have to recognize that they might be using AI to make footnotes.
Yes.
I mean, I was writing something, it was actually a kind of a prospectus for possibly doing a dissertation. I've been thinking about doing it. And I worked on this thing, and then I had to make the bibliography. I had 100 sources. And so I typed in all the books that I used and said, make me the bibliography, and put it in Chicago manual style. And it was like, boom.
Isn't that great?
It was unbelievable.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And I was like,
real work saver.
It saved me like 2 days.
Fantastic.
So I can see that is legitimate, but you can't
Yes.
have it right in your paragraphs.
Yes.
So it's just it's a struggle. But I guess one day, maybe when we're really old, we'll come back here and we'll be talking about the fact that most people now, instead of buying a new car, they're buying a robot slave in their house to do everything, but it looks and sounds like a human, and their kids are interfacing with it, and it's the nanny.
Yes.
And the kids develop feelings for it.
It's the George Jetson thing, right?
Yeah. It's going to get weird.
Yeah.
It's just going to, right? It's going to get weird.
I think it is, yeah. A lot of questions awaiting on the horizon, but, this is the beauty of the church. kind of dealing with bioethics, with medical ethics, with broad general ethical questions. The church has the root and the principles, the fundamentals here to speak meaningfully to our day and age. And, it's a great blessing to be a Catholic and to have that kind of bedrock that we can stand on. So even in the face of many new novelties, the church is usually ahead of the curve. I point out to people when it came to cloning, the church before Dolly the sheep was cloned had already issued a document about this. The recent document that came out from the Vatican on artificial intelligence was excellent. I don't know if you read it.
No, I haven't.
I recommend it. Very well done. And so on. There were some statements that came out during COVID from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, dealing with, moral issues around abortion-derived cell lines. Again, very simple, very clear, very helpful. It's a blessing to have the gift of the church to assist us in what is truly a complicated world.
Father, you are truly a gentleman and a scholar, and sometimes we throw that around, but you really are. And,
thank you.
And you're
such a pleasure to be able to, parse these fun issues with you.
Please come back and do this again. There's so many other issues we could talk about.
That's true. We could. Yes, I would look forward to it. I hope we can do it again.
We'll do it. And just the service you've done to the church. I mean, for the scientific community, to see a faithful Catholic priest being able to hang with them and lead the discussion, not just participate. You do the work. I know that you put in the time. And as I said at lunch, I'll just kind of finish with this. We think of apologetics a lot of time as like just responding to the Mormons that knock on the door, or Jehovah's Witness showed up. Oh, this is how you respond. This is apologetics in our world right now. The world needs this. The church, Holy Mother Church, needs the workers in the vineyard responding to these issues, the bioethics, all of these technological advancements we're making in the sciences. But we need faithful men and women doing this, and you're doing it every day, and you're well known for that. It's a real blessing to have spent this time with you. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Conor. Really a pleasure for me as well.
We'll do it again.
All right.
That's
Look
it.
forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks guys for checking out the Conor Gallagher Show. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, or comment, or whatever you got to do to support it. And I appreciate that very much.